Hello everyone, I'm Laura Paquette, and today I'm going to be doing a case study on Fellowship of the Ring. So, first things first, this is not my favorite book in the world, but with that being said, I can see that there's a lot of good things about it. I would even go so far as to say that it is objectively good, which first raises the question, can art be objectively good? And especially in my last video, I kind of made it seem as if that was impossible. That was not my intention. My intention was rather that it's easier for people to say, that's bad, nobody should like it, than for them to say, that's not my favorite. And so people kind of hide dislike in objectivity. But with that being said, I think we can be not perfectly objective, but objective enough to distinguish between our personal tastes and something's artistic value, which obviously requires, hard work, deliberation, and a definition of what is objectively good art. And that's something you could talk about all day and never get a final answer to. But just based off of this book, my initial thoughts are that it accomplishes what it's meant to. And again, you can't read the writer's mind, but say you see a painting, you see Munch's Scream, and you can see this distortion, these blacks, these dark fiery colors, and you feel this unease, and it's reflected in the title, and you can see that's what it's meant to be. And the same way here, you can feel the tone that Tolkien means to convey. You can feel this growing darkness, and you can feel the themes that he reiterates that I'll be talking about later. And so it definitely accomplishes what it's meant to. I think this also has reread value. I admit this is my first time reading it. I think I would get more out of it reading it again. And it's either Burke or Kant who say that you can't really determine whether or not food tastes good when you're hungry. You have to be full. And in the same way, I think there's some way in which we can't tell how good literature is until we know how it's going to end. When our curiosity has been sated, is the story still compelling? Is the language still fitting? Thirdly, I think objectively good art is appreciated outside of its time and culture and place, which is, obviously difficult because you can't just look at something and say, this is a classic now because I say so. It requires this humility and this stepping away that other people get a voice, and we are not the end all. So, all that to say, this is not my favorite, but it is a very good book. I'm not going to bash Tolkien, usually. So, without further ado, 10 good things to take away from this book. One is the beginning. And it starts a little slower than my preference, but it definitely does a good job of establishing the tone. The narrator in the beginning is how the narrator talks in the end. Obviously, the tone is very different. A lot of dark things have happened, but you immediately get a sense of who the narrator is. It also quickly establishes character, and it kind of hints at this future reckoning. So it's establishing the status quo. When in last video we talked about how you need to bring the characters back and compare and contrast them with who they start out with. Well, obviously you have to then start out in the beginning and give the status quo. And here it shows what is, but it also hints at this changing. And it's a very slow change. It's pages and pages of dialogue, but there's this build-up. And part of it is this build-up towards the party, but there's also something on the back end, something kind of like Edgar Allan Poe when you're in this haunted castle, and you can feel there's something wrong, you just don't know what's up with the House of Usher. Second, you've got the building and control of suspense, and Tolkien controls the flow of information. He filters these dark writers through unreliable witnesses, through second and third hand sources. Everything that comes to you is questions. You're not sure what exactly is true, but you can kind of see around what's going on. And in the same way, just as he kind of builds tension up slowly, he kind of releases it slowly. And so when you've had, 10 or 20 pages of these characters racing, running for their life, they don't all of a sudden just crack a joke and everything's fine. The release of tension is very slow, it's gradual. They're still kind of looking for danger, making sure they're safe before they finally relax just for something to rise up again. Thirdly, is that there's no good options. And when you have characters choosing between the Misty Mountains and the mine of Moria, I guess it's a mine, you force characters to make bad decisions without them coming across as idiots. So we know that Gandalf and Aragorn are competent, but now that we see them arguing against each other, they're not really sure what the good option is. We see their turmoil, we see them as vulnerable, but we also kind of understand why they made these choices when they choose to go into Moria and everything breaks down. I think we're a lot more compassionate toward these bad decisions when we know, bad decisions are the only thing on the table. Fourth is don't over-describe emotions. And this is really easy when you're writing an omniscient narrator. He kind of goes in and out of people's heads, but for the most part, people's emotions are described through their body language. Almost like you're watching a movie, you can see these micro expressions, but you don't know exactly what they're thinking. You kind of build it up in your own head, but also reflected in the world around them. So the way the world is described, he is describing this growing darkness, or with the elves, this break, this light, but how that thing is being described corresponds to everyone's emotions, and that's a two-way street. The frustrations of the land are reflected in the people, and the people's emotions are kind of reflected in the land, which then goes to this higher power and whether or not Sauron is destroying everything. 5, you have these differing motives and unaffiliated parties, and Tolkien kind of gets a bad rap for having these simplistic characters and these cookie cutter bad characters, which I think is very unfair. I think it says more about us in our times, how we're not willing to have one decent character like Aragorn, where everyone else, I mean, Legolas sees a troll and he gets, not a troll, a Balrog, and he gets so scared he drops his bow. Then Legolas, he's only there in the first place to say, oh yeah, we elves messed up, like Gollum. we don't know where he is. Then Boromir comes and says, I'm not here to beg, but we could really use some help. Please help Gondor. Not that I'm begging, but please help Gondor. And then Sam's just there for Frodo. He doesn't care about anyone else. And then you have these unaffiliated people, someone like Tom Bombadillo. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but he just twiddledums, and he's a good character. He saves him twice, but he is very limited. He can't take the ring. He can't go up by himself in the same way the more powerful characters, Gandalf, Galadriel, their power constrains them, and so everyone is limited. Everyone requires supporting characters. 6 is you have to show on-screen action. I think my biggest frustration with this book is there are times where Aragorn, or Gandalf especially, is doing something pretty awesome, but we don't get to see it. We don't see him, Aragorn, fight the Wraiths. We don't see, I guess Gandalf is fleeing the Wraiths. But with that being said, we do still see them do what they're supposed to do. We might not get to see Gandalf fight the trolls, but 3 pages later, we see him fight the Balrog. Tolkien isn't just saying, hey guys, take my word for it. No, we see, Gandalf, like I said, fighting the troll, not fighting the troll, fighting the Balrog, and making this final stand, even when he's physically weary and barely able to stand. With that, number 7 is everyone has limitations. And this includes the bad guys. A lot of times we like to make the threat as large as we can, and so we emphasize how great the bad guy is without giving any sort of limitations, which just isn't good strategy. It gives you a lot more options as a writer when everything is kind of clearly delineated. So we know that the trolls and orcs can't go out in the sun, and so it makes sense why they stop in Moria. It avoids, what do you call it, plot gaps. But it also has the limitations on someone like Aragorn, someone like Gandalf, these very powerful characters. They get weary, they're barely able to go on. Boromir famously falls. Everyone has a point where they can't go any farther. And with this, like, injuries don't heal instantly. Frodo's wearing this mithril armor, which is like the best armor in the world, and he takes this spear to the chest, and he's still bruised and beaten up and can barely walk, even though he's, should be dead, and he's not. 8, you don't have to focus on the whole group at once. And this was something, when I was younger, I was really bad at this. Whenever anything happened, we had to get everyone's opinion, everyone's story. But in this, sometimes I forgot where Merry and Pippin were, because they didn't matter. You don't have to write about characters when they're irrelevant. But you do want to introduce them in a very strong manner and start them off that they are memorable, so that when they do matter, we kind of understand where they're coming from, and we can kind of fill in the gaps where they're not there. We can see, okay, yeah, Merry and Pippin, they're there for Frodo. They're not as servile, for lack of a better word, as Sam. They're his cousins rather than his gardeners, so they're a little more cheeky, I guess. They're equal, but they're following him more out of fraternal love than duty, almost. Although obviously, Sam comes to love Frodo very much. But 9, morals in the story. Oh no. So I saw 2 pretty strong morals here, and one was that no one starts out evil, and small things matter. And this book is written so differently than anything you would read in this time period, because these morals are kind of just stated, and they're shown in different contexts. They're shown to mean different things, but they're not really subverted. They are just truths in the book, which it's very interesting. But it's something that matters in the story. It's not something that Tolkien just chooses to preach. He could not tell the story in the way that he does without these things being true. And they're not as simple as they first seem. So no one starts out evil. That doesn't mean, hey guys, we're all gonna do great, woohoo! No, it means that anyone can fall. It means that Gandalf or Galadriel, if they get the ring, that is no good. It means that Frodo can fall, the Fellowship can fall, Boromir does fall. But it also means there's a reason for compassion. So when Frodo finds out that Bilbo had a chance to kill Gollum and he didn't, he said, well, that's a pity. And Gandalf shakes his head and says, no, pity stayed his hand. And when you see him, if you see him, you will understand, which hasn't happened yet. They see Gollum creeping around and he says, oh no, he's gonna choke me to death. But, knowing how things are gonna end, you know that Frodo's pity for Gollum is going to save the world once his own personal will has failed him. Second, the small things matter. That's what this whole story is about, is that these hobbits, these ordinary people who have little to do with politics or war, they're like 4 feet tall, they're physically unimposing, they're written like they're from Middlemarch and they're just doing their slice of life farmer thing, but it's these kind of people who are going to change the world. But on the other hand, you have the ring, and the ring of power does not look so much, it's less in appearance, it's not as gaudy as the elven rings, as the dwarven rings, and yet this is the one that would ruin the world. 10th, this is what Tolkien is most known for, and this is world building. So I was pretty surprised when I started reading this, and it started on a pretty small scale. He's just writing about the hobbits and about the Shire, and he doesn't go off onto the dwarves and the elves and all the different types of men until much later. Secondly, he characterizes a lot by dialogue, which is interesting because it's like characterizing through a primary source in history. This are the people talking about themselves and how they're talking, what they're saying. This is all doing the heavy lifting. It's not just info dumps, though there are those too, but it's people getting to speak for themselves. Next, you have atmosphere, and this is something I've touched on in the past. This is so connected to the characters, to themselves, and to the plot. But this atmosphere, this growing darkness you see in Moria, you can't see because it's pitch dark as they're creeping towards Mordor in the south. Things are starting to die. You see the effects of this war reflected in the lands. Next is the view of history, and this is obviously a huge thing in Lord of the Rings. It connects the different realms, Rohan, Gondor. These things are all connected in history, and it's transferred through time, but it's transferred through individuals, and it's not some biodeterminism. It's not, you're from Rohan, you're gonna be a centaur horse guy, but it's that these legacies matter. That the stories your father and your uncle tell you, they matter, and it just connects back to the themes that these little people and our choices and these small things, they still matter. So, I'm coming to the end now. I don't know when I'm gonna read the next one, how soon I'm gonna make a video of it, but yeah, it was both better and not as good as I expected it to be. But anyway, that's the 10 tips to take away. If you enjoyed, hit like and subscribe.